those of you online could see who was in the audience. We have 35 people here in the house at Haywood Community College, and looks like we've got almost 25 online, which is really fantastic. One of the biggest gatherings we've had for Safe Passage. I think we had about 65 for the wildlife crossing workshop in Maggie Valley. Anyway, it's great to see folks. We're trying to work through some challenges of running an in-person and virtual meeting. I know we're going to get there. Before I start with the program, I'd like to welcome Shannon Raby up to the mic to welcome folks. He works here and leads the wildlife program at this local community college. Shannon.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm here to welcome you to Haywood Community College. My name's Shannon Raby. I'm lead instructor of Fish and Wildlife Management here at the college, and we're glad you guys could use our space down here today. And I have students. Say hi, students. In my wildlife policy and law class, I figured this was an appropriate meeting for students to attend to learn about how the public process works on conservation projects. A few housekeeping things. You are allowed to have drinks in the auditorium. Food is forbidden, but if you do want a coffee or water, it's just fine to have that in here. We have bathrooms. If you go out in the lobby and to your left down the hall, there are bathrooms and water fountains as well. And if there's anything at all that you need, ask me or one of our students while we're here, and we'll try to make things more comfortable for you. So thank you. I've got the check coming right back, so we'll get this fixed.
Great. Let me just go over our agenda. For those of you online, I put it in the chat. So we have an open reflection and setting the stage. That's myself here. Some context and methods from Steve, followed by analysis and key findings by Liz. Introduction to background on recommendations. Ron is going to kick that off, and then Steve and Liz are going to follow up. We're going to cover all 21 recommendations in our findings. And we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to have a map exercise. We're going to take a look at these maps, sort of ground truth them. Those of you from here are familiar with this landscape, many of you. So take a look, offer your comments, mingle with one another. And I'm going to encourage those of you who are already professionals to engage with the young people, make them feel welcome, make them feel included, introduce yourselves. This is a nice opportunity for them to both learn and to network. Once we have about 40 minutes to go through the map exercise, we will reconvene for some open discussion for 30 minutes, and then we'll talk about next steps and we'll adjourn. And we will be adjourning at noon sharp. Before we get off, I just wanted to take a moment to pause, to think about where we've come in 5 years as a collaborative. A lot has been accomplished, arguably a tremendous amount in a short period of time, and I might add a challenging period of time with COVID. In some ways, the COVID crisis made it a little easier on our researchers to get out into the field. Steve was the only one from our organization, MPCA, that actually traveled for a while. But they got it done, and the fruits of their labor are going to be discussed today. These are recommendations. We need to come together as a collaborative and discuss these things. What makes sense? What can we get behind? And I hope we'll have those conversations today. But I want to thank, first of all, the staff members for the DOTs, both North Carolina and Tennessee, for attending, for engaging, for providing permits. And I also want to thank the DOT board members who've been engaged in this process. Really significant. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the staff and the commissioners from the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. Again, key partners, super important, been involved from the start, and really, really grateful for that. As well as all the rest of you, right? Those of you who work for NGOs, other state, tribal, federal organizations. We wouldn't be where we are without you all. This is not an issue that can be resolved by one or two organizations. It's intractable at that level. But when you bring all the stakeholders together, you can actually make some progress. And I think we're seeing that with Harm and Den. Wanda, just an acknowledgement to Division 14 and your leadership and your staff for the progress on Harmondale and what we're seeing with the wildlife enhancements associated with that bridge replacement. I know I speak for the folks in this room when I say we're very grateful for that. Before I go on any further, I'd like to welcome Ron. He'd like to make a presentation before we kick off.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Ron Sutherland, Chief Scientist for Wildlands Network. Thank you, Jeff, for that excellent introduction. And we're very excited to help kick off this meeting by making a special, but also slightly overdue presentation due to the epidemic. But back in 2019, Wildlands Network created a vision map showing how we could connect and restore habitats in Eastern North America into a beautiful network we call the Eastern Wildway. In part, this was a GIS modeling exercise. But we also we had the Eastern Wildway painted by the super talented watercolor map artist Michael Reagan, who's based up here in Western North Carolina. And you know, I think you'll agree he did a wonderful job on the map, which I'll show you in a second. But we're actively sharing this Eastern Wildway vision to spread the inspiring message that there's still hope for biological diversity here in the East. We all work in our various ways, all our different groups work together to stitch this landscape back into one piece, to heal nature's wounds, to restore wildlife corridors, and to mitigate barriers like I-40 in the Pigeon River Gorge. But the question arose of what to do with the original painting, a question that fortunately had a clear and obvious answer. So for his generous support of wildlife conservation efforts, for his leadership, and for his superlative vision, his own superlative vision when it comes to saving the Earth's biodiversity, we would like to present the original Eastern Wildway artwork to Brad Stanback. Please join me in thanking Brad for everything he does for wildlife and habitat conservation in North Carolina and beyond. Brad, come up.
Thank you to Christine for getting this framed.
Ready to go.
Thank you. Very nice. I just appreciate all the people and organizations that have been working so hard together to make this come true. So it's good to have a token of it.
No, you're very deserving of it, Brad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And for those of you online, that presentation took place in front of the podium. Suffice to say that Ron handed Brad the painting. I'm painting the word pictures here for you since you didn't see it. With that, I'd like to welcome Steve Goodman up to the podium. He's going to kick off our agenda for us today. He's done a tremendous job. Steve.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. It's good to see everybody. Pretty exciting time. Before I go start, I just want to thank Liz, Ron, and Jeff. Oh, can you all hear me okay? Okay. I talk kind of loud anyway. I want to thank Liz, Ron, and Jeff for their partnership in this research. It's been great working with you guys. And let's see. Okay, did they go? Okay, good. No. Okay. Also, I'm going to thank many of you or all of you for your tremendous support of our research, whether it's loaning cameras, acquiring permits, collaring elk, sharing data and expertise, aerial flights, awesome media and outreach, or attending our quarterly meetings. So thank you so much. We couldn't have pulled this off without you, particularly during a pandemic. So thank you. I also want to give a more recent shout out to Tara Anderson, Travis Wilson, Ann Burrows, Dave McHenry, Terry McGuire, and just late last night, Justin McVeigh for providing some really helpful comments, reading our draft report and providing some great edits and comments. So we look forward to looking at those and considering all those and incorporating those. So thank you very much. So our collaborative's mission is to improve wildlife's ability to cross I-40 in the Pigeon River Gorge that will result in improved public safety and that will restore wildlife habitat connectivity across this nationally significant ecoscape. We employed a multifaceted research approach that's shown here with these 4 objectives. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the first 3, but for the 4th one, Liz is going to go into more detail, and I'll just read that one now to set her up. Determine elk crossings locations where elk approach the roadway and where elk are most likely to cross the interstate using GPS collar technology and subsequent analyses. And so my presentation, my goal is really to set up Liz to really discuss her analysis and our key findings. So these 4 measures together guided our draft recommendations to our DOT partners, and with the goal to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and improve connectivity. Our study area ran along the I-40. I said for the longest time runs along it, but it actually can say it ran along it now in the past, though we're still out there. But our study area ran along I-40 from the Maggie Valley exit in North Carolina, 28 miles to the Foothills Parkway in Tennessee. In December 2021, we concluded 3 years of research, which includes 2 years of camera trapping and 3 years of driving mortality surveys. Our target species were black bear, elk, and white-tailed deer. And, from my understanding, this is one of the larger studies in the Eastern US of this kind. So thanks to y'all's support, I think we pulled off something pretty special here. Again, our target species are black bear, elk, and white-tailed deer. And these were selected because they were relatively easy to monitor and are the ones of the highest concern from a driver safety perspective. But we also intentionally collected data from many other species as well, including bobcats, gray and red foxes, eastern spotted skunks, and long-tailed weasels. You can see one climbing up the tree there. And then also otters and mink. So while improving safe passage for larger mammals should in general benefit smaller critters too, several of these may actually have specific requirements that we need to think about when planning for new structures or improvements to existing ones. With that in mind, we're teaming up with NCWRC and Clemson University to have them analyze our mesocarnivore data to gain an understanding of those species relationships to I-40 and their crossing needs. So when I say mesocarnivore, obviously that's from the long-tailed weasel all the way up to coyotes and bobcats. And then rounding off this, future all species approach, we also want to think about amphibians and reptiles and other taxa as we move forward. But back to our target species. For research objective 1, through data sharing with NCWRC, TDOT, and NCDOT, we curated historic and recent mortality data in addition to our weekly driving surveys. Big thanks to Colleen Offenbuttle, Michelle Hunt, and Dave McHenry for sharing your roadkill data over these years. It's a nice present, I guess. And so Liz will talk about wildlife vehicle collision data in much more detail, but here I wanted to touch on underreporting. So sheriff-generated crash reports, carcass removals, and driving surveys are the 3 methods of data collection during road ecology studies. But typically crash reports are the only data available to the DOTs and the public. And this map depicts just the crash reports for 2018 to 2020. So you can see, not too many there. They're in the black squares. Now, and this map adds in everything else during that period. So crash report data accounted for only 16% of the wildlife vehicle collisions during this 3-year period, while surveys and carcass removals accounted for 5.3 times that amount. So again, just sheriff-generated crash reports, and then everything else with more intense effort. Hauser and all in 2007 reported that thoroughness and reliability of crash data varied widely across jurisdictions in the US. And also, even with our higher intensity monitoring efforts, many wildlife vehicle collisions still likely went undetected due to injured animals moving off the road or being dragged away from scavengers. Research by Lee and al. In 2021 reported an additional correction factor of 2.8 times that can be applied to account for these animals. So what all this indicates is that wildlife vehicle collisions can be greatly underreported by typical reporting efforts. And that's the main point I wanted to make there. For research objective 2, assessing wildlife activity within the forested highway right-of-way, we divided the highway into 116 400-meter segments. We then systematically and randomly selected 34 segments stratified by historic wildlife mortality levels. And then we excluded slopes greater than 65%. 2 cameras were deployed along each segment and usually within 40 meters of the highway. as depicted in that photo there. That's only about 20 meters away. For research objective 3, we assessed wildlife use of 21 existing structures. We selected these structures that were based on size were the only ones that, at least in our view, potentially were suitable for black bear. That was kind of like our limit. And they include metal culverts, concrete creek culverts, bridge underpasses, box culverts, river bridges, and then the single and double tunnel. So this is just a 10,000 foot view of just some of the work we did. We deployed 115 cameras, and those cameras logged in over 70,000 trap days, recording 31,000 wildlife events, including several thousand of our target species and many more thousands of several other species, quite a few species. Overall, we processed around 3 million photos. So in this map, you can see the distribution of our cameras. And a landscape feature that guided and increased the effectiveness of this distribution was the presence of road rock cuts. So steep rock cuts in the gorge developed during highway construction are really a defining feature throughout much of the gorge. These features reduced our sampling universe and improved the strength of our spatial coverage. Here we mapped all steep rock cuts approximately greater than 45-degree slope, and those are shown in black. And then the intervening more open areas, which are still kind of, some are rock cuts too, but they're lower, less slope. And those are in green. And these are all on the non-Pigeon River side of our study area where our cameras were located. So we estimated 55% of our study corridor contained these steep rock cuts with an average length of about 319 meters or 3 football fields, with the longest being around 2 miles, near the double tunnel. So rock cuts like these at Harmon Den and the Wilkins Creek tract appear to be funneling wildlife and influencing wildlife-vehicle collisions. And then in this photo of this bear mortality, note the landscape opening across the road. It's kind of hard to see with the semi, but one of the rock cuts is kind of coming down the slope and then opening up into a creek shed. And so that's when I say landscape openings. So that's what I'm talking about. And so before I hand it off to Liz, here are just a few other general observations after several years being out there. One of the biggest surprises to me after starting our research was the abundance and richness of wildlife so close to the highway. Another thing that struck me was the presence of wildlife trails paralleling the highway in some areas, indicating the highway corridor itself, along with the adjacent Pigeon River, is an important linear feature for wildlife movement in some areas. It's certainly really rugged in areas where that's not the case, but then in other key areas, that is the case. And so that was kind of, obvious to a lot of people, but that became really obvious to me over time. And here's an elk and calf moving parallel to I-40. And this was captured by one of our Nayland branch cameras. And then here is a bear walking along the Pigeon River near Harmon Den. And note in the background, the Pigeon River, not much of a barrier for wildlife movement. Of course, it becomes a raging river in certain times of year, but generally speaking, it's not much of a barrier for wildlife, for most wildlife, in my view. And I'll just leave you with this. This is Groundhog Creek. This was one of the more pleasant surprises of one of the culverts that is at least some degree working and moving at least black bear, bobcat, and coyote. But interestingly, it's still an area of high bear mortality. Just up there at grade. So there's this decision process going on, I guess. And then now I'll just pass it off to Liz there.
Okay, that looks good. Hi, everyone. Yeah, there's a lot going on this tiny little screen. And hi, everyone virtually. I'm going to be, looking at our research findings, and I'm going to stay pretty high level. Anyone that's gotten to look at the report, there's all the details in there, but I'm going to be taking all of these pieces that Steve just laid out and try to show how those go together to help us identify these mitigation areas and where we're seeing high wildlife vehicle mortality and where we can see that this is probably important functional connectivity for wildlife as well. All right, so Steve went down our data collection and talked about where the different sources for wildlife vehicle collisions were coming from. Just wanting to mention, so we ended up using 304 wildlife vehicle collisions. In all of this data, we've really cleaned it up a lot. You know, if we had locations that looked to have location errors, or if we had vehicle collision locations where that overlapped in time by different agencies, you know, we pulled that out. So we made sure we were confident in the numbers we had. And those were mostly bear and deer vehicle collisions. We only had one elk vehicle collision during our collection. And bear, the majority of those were bear, so 167. So the majority of our wildlife vehicle collisions were deer or bear, with some of those being deer. And we see that in the months of October, November, and December is when we see an increase in wildlife vehicle collisions. And, you know, you see the spike there in data collection and number of vehicle collisions in 2018, 2019, and 2020 because of those are our more focused efforts for data collection, where we had crash reports from state troopers as well as other state agencies and our surveys. And so when we're looking at hotspots, so of those 115 segments that we were surveying, wildlife vehicle collisions averaged about 2.6. You see there's quite a bit of deviation there because there was a lot of variation along the roadway. And they range between 0 and 9. And so we categorized these and we took the highest 75th percentile of these locations and we labeled those as hotspots. Those are the segments that have 5 to 9 wildlife vehicle collisions. Again, there's a lot of methods to go about this, but really we're looking for where these clusterings are happening along the landscape. If we have these clusters of collisions happening along the landscape, you can imagine there's something else going on there. These are not random. And so we identified 22 of those road segments as hotspots. And when we project and look at those spatially along our study area, we see that they kind of show up at about 10 locations. And so we have some that are just one 400-meter segment that has high wildlife vehicle collisions. But then we have these 3 other locations that have multiple hotspots strung along in these 400-meter segments. And so that's where we're really keying in on and looking at these hotspots along the landscape. And we identify those as being potential areas for prioritizing mitigation efforts. And so the next step that we took in this analysis, and the details again are in that chapter 1 report, is we want to understand, you know, what is influencing where these vehicle collisions are happening along the roadway. And using a wildlife habitat selection analysis, something called a resource selection function, where we're understanding what landscape variables and road variables are normal along the landscape. We're comparing that to where the vehicle collisions happen, and we're comparing what would be expected. You know, there's this much forest area, this much flat, we compare, but this is where these vehicle collisions are happening. Mike? Yeah. Yes. Ooh. Okay. How's that? Everybody can hear me very well now. Okay, and so we took all of the wildlife vehicle collisions, the bear, deer, and elk vehicle collisions, and we created models based on landscape characteristics. So that would be hot mic. So that would be things like forest cover, distance to water, riparian areas, and we're looking at what might influence where wildlife are crossing the roadway. So an important thing when we're looking at the results of these models, they're specific to topography outside of the road. But these models and looking at what's influencing vehicle collisions, we're really talking about 100 meters on both sides of the roadway. So these to the roadway.
Better to just let Tony make that difference. Yeah, simple. You shoot me back. Yeah, I got it. The horses. Oh, straight from the
if you guys are online, if you could mute, please. We're picking up some of your chatting. Sorry, I'm getting so thrown off. Ah, so when we, yeah. Does not fit in there. Sorry. So we created these models, we ran those against landscape characteristics, things like topography, terrain ruggedness, and also distance to the structures that Steve was just talking about. And so many road ecology studies would see that the structures that exist along the roadway can often safely pass wildlife. And so we incorporated these into models to see and rank what could be influencing these. So when we're using all of those wildlife vehicle collisions from all species, we see the number one driver is there's a higher probability of a wildlife vehicle collision near one of these roadway structures, a bridge, bridges, or culverts. And we know that in some of our other analysis, we're looking at, is there an influence of species? We have bear and deer together in these models. We know that ecologically, they use habitats very differently, but also bear are making up a large portion of the wildlife vehicle collisions within our model. So then we run models specific to what's influencing bear wildlife vehicle collisions and deer. And again, both species, we see higher probabilities near road structures. Again, those bridges and culverts. And for bear, we also see a higher probability of bear vehicle collisions near forest cover. And that makes a lot of sense. In the most recent studies with bear in our area, Brunstein and University of Tennessee and the Smokies, forest cover was the number one driver of bear habitat selection and movement. So that makes a lot of sense. So where preferred habitat for bear is, and also near these structures, is where we see a higher probability of bear wildlife vehicle collisions. And then we use that information for deer as well. We don't have as many deer vehicle collisions. There's not a lot of predictive ability of these models, but they still allowing us to kind of rank and try and get at what on the landscape specific to the road is influencing these. And for deer, we see, again, that influence of the structures influencing where these vehicle collisions are happening. For deer, we see that the probability of deer wildlife vehicle collisions increase in areas with less ridge top. So that also is a bit of an indicator. It's slightly loose, but that, we know that deer are often using these more bottom areas, foraging in these grass areas, and tend to stay off ridge lines for the most part. And so we see, these models kind of help guide us what might be influencing where these are occurring along the road, and they make biological sense. So I think that just kind of helps us pull these pieces together. And then moving on to when we monitored wildlife in the cameras along the roadway in 33 different segments, we wanted to compare, so where we've seen these hot spots of vehicle mortality, are those lining up with animal activity adjacent to the roadway? So that's why we set up our study design. We have wildlife vehicle collision counts in segments, but now we're monitoring activity rates by our target species in these segments using cameras. And as you can see, it varies along the roadway, but what was interesting is in all of the segments we monitored, bear and deer were detected in all of them. So we see, at least for those segments we monitored, and as you see, that's from the north, that's from our entirety of our study area. We got well, it was only 33 segments, we got a good variation along the landscape, and bear and deer omnipresent throughout the gorge. We only see elk in about 20%, 21% of those cameras, but still, we see them in both Tennessee and North Carolina. It's not just in one location. And the graph there at the bottom, detection rates as far as we're seeing about three, the average about 3 bear detections per 100 days in these cameras. And we're detecting more deer in these cameras. So average detection rate for deer was around 11 per 100 days. And as you can see, the elk are on the far right of this graph. I can't, it's a lot. We didn't get a lot of elk detections and a lot of variation, but as you can see with both deer and bear, we had some real outliers. 114, the farthest kind of area north towards the east of our study area, some really high deer detection rates. and some bear detection rates too. So some variation along the roadway. Again, at least for me, a lot of this was set up because I really wanted to get at, where these hotspots in wildlife vehicle collisions, is that where we see high activity? So we do this comparison and we see that actually we don't find a relationship there in how we've at least divided up this data. And how you can't see down here in the bottom, so it's very difficult to see, but these are the number of wildlife vehicle collisions. And on the y-axis here are the detection rates. And you can see that in some areas where there's, this would be 0 vehicle collisions, we still have high deer detection rates. And we see that here for bear detections as well. In areas where we have low vehicle collisions, we still have high bear detections. So we didn't determine a real relationship there. I thought that was surprising. But we can visualize and look at our study area, and we see that places, maybe these places where wildlife activity is relatively high and wildlife vehicle collisions are low, maybe wildlife are safely crossing the road. And you can kind of see that when we look at the landscape, for instance, and I guess it's important to say, so the majority, about 70%, 76% of bridges and culverts occurred in close proximity to wildlife vehicle collision hotspots. But these locations I've laid out here, the high bridge, double tunnel, and single tunnel, those are all structures where their hotspots aren't near these structures. So potentially they are safely passing wildlife. And that makes sense when we look at the detection rates of both the double tunnel and the single tunnel. We're not able to confirm crossings based on how these structures are splayed out and being able to say, yes, this animal from up here crossed there. But the detection rates at both of those sites are very high compared to other structures. And then the high bridge, essentially over Jonathan Creek, almost like a viaduct, that is crossing elk and deer and seems to be an important crossing place currently. And that's where we're seeing those high deer detection rates. So, that's exciting to see that, some of these structures out there seem to be improving wildlife's ability to cross the roadway. But beyond that, we are seeing this effect of where these road structures are, we have increased wildlife vehicle collisions. So overall, the crossing events were low. So the graph here is showing the number of confirmed crossing at road structures. And specific to, we saw an animal enter a structure, we saw that animal exit within a 30-minute time period. So that's pairing those together. So we see a varying degrees of use by wildlife, and that, again, that 76% of bridges and culverts in close proximity to hotspots. So overall, what's going on is, and you see this in the literature, there's other road ecology studies that have found that where hydrology and water's moving are important crossing places for wildlife, but also where we've built our inroad structures, where our structures are mostly passing, that we've monitored are mostly passing water, or they're passing vehicles. And so we're seeing wildlife likely, again, our analysis specific to the roadway, wildlife are being funneled by the topography, habitat requirements, how these animals move through the landscape, and they're ending up on the roadway near these structures. This is where we've put our roads, are kind of the paths of least resistance for us as well. And also, our waterways also are conducive for movement. So we're seeing animals show up on the roadway, there's a structure there. And while we're seeing them at times use those, they're ending up crossing at road grade. And that's why we're seeing that elevated influence of vehicle collisions being near structures. And I think that's the big takeaway and the thing to discuss. I think that allows us to have a lot of opportunities if these are already places where we're identifying animals are moving. And then the next piece, and just kind of quickly going through the elk data. So of the 13 elk we had monitored with GPS collars, 3 of those animals interacted with the roadway. And one of those animals, specifically our I-40 cow that we've been talking about this entire time, crossed the roadway when we calculated these. So we took successive locations and we created steps or tracks between successive locations in time. These are 1 hour locations of elk. So we created those steps, and we used where they intersect with which road segment to identify the number of crossings of that animal. And then we had another metric because we had 2 other animals in the red and the blue down there that never crossed the roadway, but they interacted with it, and they were using habitat in those areas. So we came up with just a metric of approaches. So a 200-meter buffer around the roadway, we extracted the number of steps within 200 meters associated with those segments. So 107 times this elk crossed north there in Tennessee, both at the Waterville Bridge where the Appalachian Trail crossing is. That's where folks cross up the interstate for the Appalachian Trail as well. And then just northwest of that, the Nail and Branch Creek drainage, and we'll be going into these spots a little bit more with our recommendations. And then the approach steps were in the Cove Creek area. Small population, part of the elk population exists in this area, and we see a lot of road interaction there at the beginning of our study area in North Carolina. Yeah, what I thought was interesting, and though you'd imagine some more overlap, just having 3 animals and using these 3 different places along the interstate give us some good understanding of where these potential conflict areas are going to be with elk, not only now, but in the future as the population continues to grow. And so just in summary, our research identified wildlife vehicle collision hotspots and revealed that wildlife vehicle collisions are driven by where bridge culvert structures are along the roadway and where species-specific habitat intersects the road. And due to higher probabilities of wildlife vehicle collisions and elk use near the structures and the limited use of structures by wildlife, priorities for mitigation efforts should focus on those. And also focus on retrofitting these existing structures, create new dedicated crossing structures for wildlife, and incorporate fencing to provide multiple and adequate safe crossing opportunities, not only to exclude animals from the roadway, but help funnel them to these crossing opportunities. Future research and, with the elk modeling that we're doing currently, data has been messy and taking more time on that process, but hopefully we can get a better idea of topography and how the greater landscape is at least funneling and moving elk along the landscape into the roadway. Might give us some more inference on how other animals might be moving. And then quickly, I really want to give a special shout out to our research partners, specifically all the folks shown here have in some way added to our ability to do this research by providing data, funding for data, or helping with partnerships. And because so much of my Wildlands Network colleagues are here, they're all dispersed. I want to thank them all. Nikki, Christine, Ron, and Alex is back there. The good looking maps are Alex did them. But yeah, I want to thank you guys. They've been doing behind the scenes stuff and supporting me. So.
Nice. Okay. So let me set the stage in terms of how we arrived at the recommendations chapter. You've all received that. It's chapter 3 of the report. And we put it together. You might be wondering how we put it together. So I'm going to give a quick overview of how we approached that, building off of all the data that Liz and Steve just shared. And what we did, we took some early versions of the maps you have here. And back in February, Liz, Steve, Jeff, and I got a hole up in a little private conference room in Asheville. And we went through all the data that we had and looked through it segment by segment and said, which of the areas along the gorge look like they are prime targets for some kind of mitigation of habitat connectivity across Interstate 40 in the Pigeon River Gorge. And as Liz just said, we're not seeing that much wildlife going through the existing infrastructure on the gorge. And we're also seeing lots of road mortality. And as Steve said, that the road mortality we're seeing is just a tiny fraction of the overall road mortality that's happening in the gorge. So there's lots and lots of room, lots and lots of opportunities, we think, for improving habitat connectivity in this Pigeon River Gorge environment. So we went through it piece by piece, and for all the existing structures that are out there, we talked about those and said, what could we do to fix this structure so it would work better for wildlife? In some cases that was replace it altogether. In some places it was mostly leave it alone. And then we also went through, at the end of that, we also went through and said the areas between these crossing structures, what are we missing? Where would it be nice to have a new crossing structure, or at least to look for opportunities to put a new crossing structure in? And so that process is how we ended up with the list of 21 different recommendations that you see in that chapter 3 report. And then once we had those 21, then we kind of started the cycle over again, got some more coffee, and said, of these 21 sites, which are the highest priority ones that we all agree on, at least the folks that were in that room. And that's how we got sort of settled on the 7 high priority sites that are listed in the start of that recommendations chapter, shown here. And I will, let's see if I can do this with the mouse. I'll run through them quickly. So consider these as draft priority sites, because we're looking forward to your feedback, taking the research and the data and translating it into recommendations for structural improvements. It's a bit of an art, and so we need your feedback on this. We need your assistance. But these are the 7 that we came up with, and I'll just go through them quickly. And I guess I should say, first of all, that the North Carolina DOT is already actively replacing 5 bridges in the Pigeon River Gorge on the North Carolina side. We did not include any of those 5 bridge replacements in our 7 because they're already kind of underway, and we'd already provided some feedback on those. So these are in addition to those structures. And Liz and Steve are going to cover, and myself are going to cover some of these in more detail, so I'm just going to read them off. We have the Wilkins Creek overpass. I'm not going to be able to do that with that. The single tunnel is obviously an opportunity to build another overpass to cover the other side of the interstate there. Cold Springs Creek, that bridge is being replaced, but that leaves the exit ramp culverts, which are a bit of an obstacle to wildlife. Groundhog Creek, which you saw, Steve shared the pictures of. Waterville Bridge, where the elk have been going under, but also the Appalachian Trail goes under that bridge. I think that one's up for replacement as well by Tennessee. Nyland Branch and Laurel Hollow are also what we consider to be prime opportunities for wildlife enhancement in the gorge. And one obvious question that comes to mind is, here's a list of 7. Is that prioritized enough, or do we need to go further and narrow that down even more, at least for the initial phases of kicking this off and really making some progress, mitigating the wildlife barriers of this highway. And Liz mentioned this in her recommendations. Fencing is key. If you want, the studies around the world have shown that fencing is critical for guiding animals to use these wildlife crossings. I mean, our research shows right now the existing scenario in the gorge is you have some places for wildlife to cross, and they're not using them. They're going towards them, and then they're going up and over the highway and getting run over. And fencing is the way to prevent that. And it's not just your standard highway safety fencing that is mostly good for keeping me from going on the highway, but for wildlife, what you need is like a 10-foot tall, special wildlife enhanced fence. Like this fence here is actually from the coast, from US 64. The bear crossings they installed, bear red wolf crossings they installed down there. They installed I think about a mile of 10-foot tall fence on either side of those crossings. And that's what we need to see in the gorge, with the caveat being in the gorge, as you saw in Steve's presentation, the gorge is full of all these really steep rock cuts. And so that constricts, but sort of helpfully constricts where we need to install a fencing, because there's probably no sense in installing a fence on a cliff, basically. So fencing is critical. And I think we can really zero in on the places where fencing is going to be most helpful for guiding animals there. And then to complement the fencing, inevitably in other road projects around the country, what ends up happening is even if you have good fencing, animals still end up on the highway. And so what clever people have devised are things called jump outs, and that's what you're looking at here. This is one of the ICOET road ecology conferences out in Utah on a snowy day, and we were looking at a jump out, and the animals hit the fence in the background of the image there, and if they choose to go left, then they'd come up this little grassy ramp. If they're already on the highway, let's say they're already on the highway, they're trying to get off, they come up the little grassy ramp and they say, hey, they can jump over that little ramp, that wooden barrier right there. And then they're free, they can get off the highway. But animals coming from the other direction, what they see is not a nice little ramp, but they run into that little wall. And that's the idea of a jump out, is it's sort of a one-way exit ramp off the interstate. And then, you know, I don't have a picture of it, but the other idea, you know, I-40 through this Pigeon River Gorge has a number of exits, and each of those exits is going to inevitably create a gap in the fencing. We don't want gaps in the fencing. That's where animals are going to come through. It's hard to do that perfectly, especially for the carnivores, the bears. Those animals are really adaptable and resilient. Hopefully they'll learn to go under the crossings anyways. But for the ungulates, the deer and the elk in particular, you can use modified cattle guards. If you've ever been out west, you've seen cattle guards, which are basically a series of slats right on the side of the road, right on the road actually. And the large, like, you know, cows and things like that are not willing to walk across a set of rounded metal bars to get across to the other side. Deer and elk are kind of the same way. And so we think, and the NCDOT is already looking at factoring some of these into their crossings on the bridges they're installing. We think that wildlife guards could be a great enhancement. That's just a sort of a smattering of the sorts of things that need to go hand in hand. You know, so we have those top 7 sites. We need to use fencing and all these other mitigation techniques to stitch that together into a system so that wildlife can get across this interstate. So next, I'm just going to run through the first 5 or 6 of the 21 crossings, and I'll turn it back over to Steve and Liz to cover the rest. But the first one up there, number 1, that is the on the right. That's the hybrid, and then so we're sort of starting North Carolina and we're heading into Tennessee. So here's the high bridge, so you can see it a little better. We call it the high bridge just because it is such a huge, massive bridge. And as Liz said, the defining feature of the high bridge is that it seems to be working fairly well for wildlife. It's got elk going underneath it already. It is especially on the south side of the bridge on the top there. There's already a large expanse of space for wildlife to go under this bridge. And so our core recommendation is to sort of keep that as it is, as this bridge is slated for replacement. So keep that nice area on the south side as it is. And on the north side, the slope is a little steep. We still saw wildlife using it, but it'd be great to build a bench for wildlife to go under the highway at this location. That would just make it so much better than having to go across that steep slope. Luckily, the slope is not covered in riprap, so that's nice. Okay, moving west, we have number 2 is the low bridge. And this bridge is not quite as good for wildlife because it's same road, but it's much more constricted on the smaller road that goes under the interstate there. You can see there's not much room for wildlife. We didn't get much use, I don't think, of this particular site, but if this bridge is being slated for replacement, and our idea is that if possible, it'd be great to add a space for wildlife adjacent to the road here when we replace this road. So, you know, we're recommending basically about 30 feet wide, 10 feet tall, so there'd be plenty of room for an elk to go under this road. And that, you know, hopefully that could be possible when that road is replaced, or the bridge is replaced. And then this next one, number 3, is actually the gap. There's no structures really to speak of, at least that are large enough for our target species, between the low bridge on the right there, and then the Pigeon River Bridge on the left. And I think if I go to my next slide, yeah, there we go. So this gap, we're not sure how important this gap is. There's elk in that area, there's deer in that area, there's a lot of private land in that area sort of mixed in. And so what we think needs to happen there, that, you know, we didn't come up with any firm recommendations as to what to do, but we did decide that, you know, somebody's got to go in and do some more research, I think, to try to figure out, you know, do we need another crossing structure in this gap area between the low bridge and between the Pigeon River Bridge. It's a few miles long, and it's probably worth considering. Okay, and then the next one is the Pigeon River Bridge, number 4, up there. And this is another very tall bridge. unfortunately, its design is not quite as suitable for wildlife, in part because on the left side, you can't see it in this image, on the left side of this bridge, it's actually a really steep rock cliff with a small gap at an angle on a cliff, basically, for animals to get under the bridge. Humans are able to scramble under it. We maybe saw some animals of like live or goats or something using it, but mountain goats apparently were going under this thing. So the two recommendations we have, when they replace this bridge is also up for replacement. On the far side of the bridge there, in theory, they're going to be building a level access road as they replace that bridge. If that level access road could be simply left in place, that would certainly provide ample room for wildlife on the far side. On the near side, we didn't think that giant rock structure, unless it gets blown up during the bridge replacement structure process, probably the rocks are going to stay, but there's still, we think, room to dig a bigger area underneath that corner of the bridge so that animals don't have to duck and cover to get underneath there. So Pigeon River Bridge could be made better for wildlife as well. And then number 5 is the Fines Creek Culvert. This is a big rounded concrete culvert with a natural bottom. It's probably one of the better culverts for wildlife, for aquatic wildlife going underneath I-40 because it has that natural bottom. I think we got deer using this bridge a fair bit. So it's a good culvert. We think it's working pretty well for some species, but what could improve it, especially for mesocarnivores that don't want to get their feet quite as wet, like bobcats and the spotted skunks, like weasels, things like that, is this is a prime opportunity to put some shelving on one or both sides of this culvert so the animals could walk along the side of it and not get wet. And just depending on sort of the hydrological limitations of how much water flow they need to keep going to that bridge. That was our best guess for the Fines Creek Culvert. And then the last one I'll cover briefly here is the Fines Creek Bridge, which is not as good for wildlife. It's very similar to that low bridge I showed. It's just a very, very small opening. And again, this bridge I think is also up for replacement. It's probably a lower priority project for us in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the other wildlife opportunities in the gorge. But if this bridge is being replaced anyways, if you could add a space for wildlife similar to the low bridge, add another space for wildlife to go underneath it, that would just provide one more opportunity for deer and elk and bear to get under the highway. So I think that's it for me. Thank you.
And let me ask you, can you all hear me without the microphone? Okay, good. I got a loud voice, so I'm just gonna go for that. So great job again, Ron. That was good. So I'm gonna go over sites 7 through 14. And I'm gonna paraphrase our actual core recommendations. Ron had them up on the screen. I'm just gonna really read them. And then also I'll just go over a couple little highlights for each site to kind of move it along. But if you want more justification and the data used for that justification, that's in that chapter 3. And that's a really nice chapter that actually Ron led the effort on that. So for the first one is that Wilkins Creek Box Culvert B. So the core recommendation is to maintain and enhance that existing structure. So the structure, I mean, it's pretty large. It is suitable and we got some use, but there's a relatively high amount of human activity. It's that one culvert where you can, I've never seen it in other interstates, but it's one where you can like go underneath the highway without an exit. It's kind of interesting. But a lot of human activity, particularly at night when animals may be moving. And then there's a little bit of a terrestrial connectivity constraint because right there is between the highway and Waterville Lake, which is, it's not necessarily a barrier, but it's, it's somewhat of a barrier for wildlife. There's some land in between that. So there's a little bit, some limitations for that area, but the structure itself is big enough to move wildlife. Next, moving to Wilkins Creek Box Culvert A, the core recommendations are to maintain the existing box culvert and tie into wildlife fencing to enhance its use. Also, construct a wildlife overpass to the north of the existing culvert, large enough to promote use by elk, bear, and deer, along with the full range of terrestrial wildlife. And then third, pursue land conservation efforts to ensure that parcels on either side of that mitigation effort remain undeveloped and suitable for wildlife. And that goes the case for any major, obviously, expenditure. We need to make sure the lands are protected, conservation easement or whatnot on either side. And so on this one, so this area, it's high wildlife activity. It's one of our highest areas of mortality. It's a large landscape opening. And we have the opportunity to permanently link the Hurricane Mountain system to across the river to the Wading Branch Ridge system on the other side of the river. And this also area is good because it's got a good staging area if a structure was to be built. A lot of opportunity for that because it's near, it's near the rest area. So next is the single tunnel, and the core recommendations are to construct an overpass over the 2 lanes of exposed highway, extending the natural bridge that is formed by the other 2 lanes passing through the tunnel. So that's why we call it the single tunnel. And then establish a clear wildlife path from the overpass leading down to the river to help animals navigate the steep slope that is at least in part covered in riprap. And so this area, oh, there it is. Okay. So this is an area of very high bear activity. Have the opportunity to permanently link the Hurricane Mountain system going across the river to the Long Arm Mountain system on the other side of the river. And also with fencing, this would help alleviate one of the hot spots moving left from the single tunnel north to the Hurricane Creek Road, where there's less opportunities for structures there. And this also has a few good staging areas. If everybody agreed this would be a good location. And of course, if funding was available. Next is the Hurricane Creek Culvert. The core recommendation is to provide a dry shelf for mesocarnivores along one side of the culvert, and then consider adding lighting in the middle of the culvert with careful consideration of any existing bat roosting, which is probably likely. So this site actually, so this area has very high bear activity, high mortality, and this structure is really quite massive. But the issue is it's long, dark, wet, and it's deep in a creek shed. So not really sure how much kind of modification can be done, but so we're offering these suggestions to help at least get some wildlife using that, because it's such a big structure. It would be nice to kind of move some wildlife. And this is one of the sites where we had cameras for 2 years, and I'm not sure we documented anything. We had a deer walk in and walk out. We had raccoons approach, and I'm sure things are using it because we couldn't do full coverage, but it's as far as the size, it's definitely big enough. Okay, so now we move to Cold Springs Bridge and culverts, and the core recommendation here is to construct the new bridge in accordance with the plans already released by NCDOT, which depicted a wide shoulder for wildlife at grade along Cold Springs Road and benches for wildlife above Cold Springs Creek as it passes under the interstate. And so I've had the opportunity to see this bridge going up, and it's gone up really fast. It's really cool. I've seen the benches being developed. It's really cool. And I think his name is Steve Hummels. The other day he flagged me down and he was talking about jump outs. I'm like, wow, this is really happening. So big shout out to NCDOT. This is the first kind of thing in our project area where it's going to be improvements for wildlife. So it's great progress. Also at the sites, once the bridge replacement is finished, we would recommend replacing the on-off ramp culverts with larger structures with natural substrate bottoms and dry passage opportunities. So this area has multiple little areas of high mortality, and it's a really high value wildlife corridor, both terrestrially and aquatically, with the Cold Springs Creek there. And this is an area where we can permanently link Harmondon Mountains across the river to the Long Arm Mountain system. And of all the 5 bridge replacements, they all have their importance to some degree, but this one is definitely the most important one. And so I'm glad this one got going first. Next is Groundhog Creek, and the core recommendations here are to replace the 3 pipe culverts at this location with a much larger culvert structure or structures that would pass all target species with a natural bottom for fish and aquatic life passage. And then add a dry passage by elevating one of those culverts above the normal level of the stream, which would still allow for flood events, but then during regular water flow, we allow for a dry passage. And then we threw this in there too, because this is a deep, in a deep creek shed, but actually kind of a U-shaped creek shed. So it's actually a lot of wildlife's using this and moving through here. Alternatively, you could look at the possibility of constructing an overpass in this location if the culvert replacement wasn't feasible. So this is an important natural corridor that's actually still functioning somewhat. Very high bear activity and high mortality. It's in this area of a series of creek drainages, like 4 or 5 creek drainages that come and flow under the highway to the Pigeon River. And so here, this another with some modifications, we can really improve aquatic connectivity at this Groundhog Creek site, because the other sites have hanging culverts on the other side, which you're not going to get a lot of movement between the river and the creek. But at Groundhog, it's the way it's placed, it's a lot closer to actually the creek bottom. Next is the double tunnel. And so the core recommendation here is investigate potential U.S. Forest Service special designation to ensure protection of the forest lands adjacent to and on top of the natural land bridge at this location. So this is U.S. Forest Service. I feel like I'm 12 again. U.S. Forest Service lands. And then construct an easily traversable trail for wildlife leading down from the land bridge across the access road and through the riprap down to and east along the Pigeon River. So this, of all of our camera sites, and we had a lot of cameras up here, this was the highest, we recorded the highest wildlife diversity and use. It's currently functioning as a wildlife corridor. It definitely needs improvements in that riprap to kind of, connect, help animals flow, down to the river and parallel to the river. But, when you think about the 2,500 miles of I-40, and I-40 is one of the largest interstates in the country, going basically coast to coast, I did a little research, and I think this is the only land bridge in that whole area, the whole section. And at least speaking in North Carolina, I mean, this is the only thing like it in North Carolina that I know of. So we actually have a land bridge, which is kind of cool. So I guess we could take credit. We all can take credit for that. And so I put do no harm, because this is one of those circumstances where you really want to think in the future, right? It needs some improvements, like I said, but we don't want to mess it up for future when it's functioning so well. So sometimes you got to, think in advance too, and do no harm as well. And then Snowbird Creek, and this one actually I circled. We don't have a photo of that one. And thanks to Ram, because he really thought through this, trying to kind of fill in some gaps, and he was right on about this place. So here we would recommend replacing the existing culvert with a larger culvert structure suitable for bear and deer, including dry passage options for terrestrial wildlife. And so this is really interesting. This is a really rugged area, and this is one of the few landscape openings in that area. But this creek flows from an expansive riparian valley system, then under the highway to the river. High deer and bear activity, high historic mortality. We didn't get as much during our driving surveys, but historically it was a high. It kind of ended up being high. And then the existing culvert is not suitable. And then this is my last slide. So all of our recommendations are for or near existing structures, which makes sense, as Liz and Ron said, because these are situated in areas with the greatest paths of least resistance, attractive to both humans and wildlife. But few existing structures are functioning well for wildlife. And then the 21 recommendations may seem like a lot, but when we consider species home ranges, climate variability, high wildlife vehicle collisions, low existing road permeability, exacerbated by Jersey barriers throughout, traffic and habitat fragmentation, which will only get worse in the private areas moving forward, these represent a long-term solution. Nothing's going to happen overnight, but with each, like the Harmon Den, it's a step in the right direction. And then now I'll pass on to Liz to talk about Tennessee.
Okay, so I'm going to be rounding this out with, we're in Tennessee now. So the last map covers our Tennessee study area with 8 miles in Tennessee. So rounding out to the 21, I'll be starting with 15 here. I've got the stars on there, and those were our top priority. These 3 here made our top priority to have the stars. So starting with the Waterville Bridge, you see we have some elk and deer movement through there. So our recommendations for the Waterville Bridge, now this is in Tennessee, but this bridge is also being slated to be replaced. Though we haven't interacted with the Tennessee DOT as much as we have with the North Carolina bridge replacements, but the same time period, so it's slated to be replaced as well. And you know, we've seen elk, you know, both on our GPS collars, you can see track going through there, and this is where we're seeing that cow elk move through, and we got her on our camera. This is also where the Appalachian Trail crosses under the interstate. And so we're asking for, you know, again, in these bridges that we think with replacement, having a dedicated area, creating a dedicated area for wildlife to move under the bridgeway. And here, you know, we'd want to incorporate that with AT hikers too, see a real opportunity with both AT hikers and elk passageway. So creating another pathway and potentially separating that with some sort of guard railing, or even using the pillars that might be holding up the bridge structure. So some sort of separated area for wildlife to cross through. And then again, you know, we're talking about some fencing and things like that. But, you know, we have these opportunities. We're seeing this influence of where these structures are in the landscape, but you see in some Ron's recommendations in here on the Tennessee side, big elephant in the room, some of these multi-use, you know, vehicles or pedestrians and wildlife are great, but the ideal is having a dedicated structure for wildlife. So that's where you see, you know, consider the potential. We have public lands on both sides here. That's really what we key into as well. Got Cherokee National Forest. And so this is a big one, seeing the elk movement. We imagine with elk moving through here now, potential and more of that in the future as the population grows. And then just a little farther on from that, I combine these two. These aren't structured areas. We're calling them Pigeon River Bend. It's just a generic term we put together. And then also this Tinker Branch. So purple here on these Google Maps is Cherokee public lands. And just trying to show the lay of the land, that those are our elk locations. And so we see a lot of elk activity. We're getting out of where we have public to public on both sides. We see a real draw for elk. And I believe, Justin, do you see a lot of your locations pile up on this open like rock quarry by chance in this Cove Creek area? Yeah, we have this effect from our animals spending a lot of time near the roadway, and there's this big opening rock quarry here. But when we're trying to site, we're thinking about potential dedicated areas for an overpass and getting elk on the other side of the road. We've identified these places to consider for an overpass or a large culvert. And then the nail and branch area, very little use, maybe a bear using that, and not a lot of wildlife, but some wildlife detection area. But this is where we see our elk cross at road grade. So this is and the big features here, this is one of the only places in the gorge, in my opinion, when you walk up and there's these flat grass areas, the slopes really shallow, both coming off the Pigeon River has a little barrier island here. See a lot of elk locations from our one elk that we've been talking about crossing the road, but also some really nice grassy ways. And along with those rock cuts, when you're traveling on the roadway, imagine an animal coming up to the road and wanting to cross. A line of sight, a flat line of sight is really important. And this area of nail and branch, though some culverts that did not pass much wildlife, you see a big step down on the Pigeon River side, and you know, some potential collapse of this structure. Here we've got a young fawn checking it out, and then our elk, we did not detect any of that structure. This would be too small for an elk, but she's crossing at road grade here. Got all these nice grasses and open field, and so that's kind of the effect there. So, but also need to mention the land conservation issue here. This is not public land on both sides, but we're seeing, you know, quite a draw from elk. Imagine that would continue. And so that was one of our top priorities, nail and branch. And then we did have a lot of, in the Hartford area, you know, we don't see necessarily a hot spot there, but that was one of our highest areas for deer vehicle collisions. And the structures we monitored there under some of the ramps, you know, they kind of comparing them to the other structures, they're quite small, they're step ups. We haven't taken those too seriously, but with the deer vehicle collisions and the population increases and potentially use of that Hartford area, considering something like these detection systems or traffic warning systems to let folks traveling on the roadway know to look out for wildlife. This is one of those kind of an adaptive potential there to limit deer vehicle collisions in that heavily trafficked area. Well, and then the final two, one being the Pigeon River Bridge in Tennessee. We're looking at the north end of the bridge here. There's the Bluffton Road where runs along this end. And we didn't really focus on any we didn't see a lot of wildlife in that area. And with the roadway there, you know, not necessarily wanting to create a draw or some limitations with the road on this side. But we saw a lot of wildlife use of this Pigeon River Bridge on that far side. You see the slope's quite steep. It's not terrible, but we saw a lot of wildlife, you know, and this makes a lot of sense, the large Pigeon River wildlife to be able to cross. And this is Cherokee National Forest on both ends. So having this riparian corridor in in Cherokee National Forest, but we wanted to, you know, we suggested creating a bench, a 2 to 3 meter bench carved out of this upper slope. It looks, it's quite steep. So trying to figure out some sort of benching there, given our experience just under there, considering that it would maybe need to be, you know, the embankment needs to be kind of packed and that would actually have to be kind of constructed so that it was stable. But I think that would really help facilitate movement for more wildlife. And then the final location is Laurel Hollow and also a top priority site. And so on the landscape, this looks like a really important area too. If we're talking about gaps or where topography comes into the landscape to influence wildlife showing up near the roadway. And so we had quite a bit of animal activity at Laurel Hollow. Again, public lands on both sides in this area. And we're suggesting that replace the Laurel Hollow Creek culvert with a structure. I think this is an important area, especially for bear and deer. And so a larger diameter, 7 to 10 meters or 4 meters high. And also because of the step up, this is another one Steve kind of alluded to some of these culverts having step ups. And again, this would make it difficult for smaller wildlife and mammals to reach. So again, you know, doing some efforts to make these structures larger and accessible by a variety of wildlife. And that's what I got for.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for the folks in the room here and for those of you online. We're going to take a break. Let's see what time it is, 10:57. If we can return here by 11:05, we're going to break out and look at the maps, and I will be facilitating that discussion in the virtual space as well. So we'll resume shortly. Thank you. All righty, everybody. Thank you so much. We're trying to provide as rich an experience for the folks online as we can. It is challenging, but I want to give the folks online an opportunity to make some comments, ask some questions. We do the same for the folks here in the auditorium. If you want to be recognized with a question, if you could use the reaction button and raise your hand, I can call on you. But we do have a question for Liz Hillard from Joe Clark, USGS. He's based at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Liz, do you think the crossing structures are increasing wildlife vehicle collisions, or are these structures just in places, creeks or roads, where wildlife want to cross anyway? There you go.
Thanks for the question, Dr. Joe Clark. I believe that this animals are ending up in these locations on the landscape because these are the paths of least resistance, where water is moving through the landscape, or where we've built our roads and slopes and pathways through the landscape are easier for movement. So yeah, I think they're being funneled to these locations. I don't think they're increasing because we weren't detecting any vehicle collisions on these like side roads necessarily. We don't have that information, but yeah, I believe that it's where these animals are ending up, but it's not increasing where they are. It's just a matter of where they end up along the roadway and where they decide to cross.
Thank you, Liz. Let's see if we got another comment here online. Okay. Anyone else online have any questions? Raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to acknowledge folks here in the crowd. Let me see. One thing I want to share for the folks in the room and for the folks online, if you have not received copies of the draft research report, it was first distributed to the DOT on March 14th and then sent to the remaining stakeholders, attendees of past meetings a week later. If you would like copies of that report, please email me at jhunter@npca.org and I will send those to you. Your comments are really important because we want to incorporate them into the final report. This is a draft. Thank you, Rory. She put my email in the chat. Anyone here in the audience? What have you taken away from this exercise? You find these recommendations reasonable? Are they? We haven't done feasibility studies, obviously, because the researchers aren't engineers, right? We don't know if some of the recommendations are possible because of the underlying geology and other factors. But love to take the temperature of the room or have someone ask questions that I may not be thinking about. Justin.
I think all the overpass and bridge recommendations so far have been pretty reasonable. The only one that I question at all are the Tennessee ones, and specifically regarding elk, because in Tennessee, you're outside the elk zone during hunting season, people can harvest that elk. So do we want to facilitate more elk crossing, more elk in that part of the world that's outside of their elk zone, and just have them be shot during the hunting season?
Okay, so for the folks online who couldn't hear that was Justin McVeigh with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, and he said he has some concerns about the Tennessee recommendations, specifically crossings related to elk, and the reason is in Tennessee there's not an elk zone. So he asked the question, do we want to facilitate the movement of those animals into an area where they can be harvested by someone with a hunting license who's looking to shoot deer and finds an elk? So I think that's a good and important question. I think it's certainly a question we want to hear TWRA's position on. We don't have someone in the room here from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and I don't see anyone online. But a good question, and we'll flag that, and we can discuss that with the folks in Tennessee. Sure. Steve Goodman is going to respond. I'm going to give him the mic so the folks online can hear.
Great question, Justin. So, for me at least, I'm not really thinking, obviously, we want structures to be able to move out, but these are in areas where there's gaps in the landscape for connectivity in general. So whether it's elk, bear, deer, or everything else, there's still areas of mortality. So the goal is to improve connectivity. We can't manage what species are on the landscape. So do you see my point? And so maybe it's not the best way to sell it in the sense of, or maybe you can even argue about the type of structure, but I think those areas still need mitigation to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and to improve, generally speaking, large mammal movements. So that's kind of my perspective. And also, that was all I had. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Steve. Just creating space for the folks online. Thoughts? All right, how about back in the room here? Hugh, come on up so folks can hear. Would you mind coming up and using the microphone? Hugh Irwin from the Wilderness Society. Here you go, Hugh.
Yeah, and tremendously impressed by this work, just awesome work in characterizing the needs of these animals and pointing out potential for improving wildlife passage. And I guess one of the things I left wondering is y'all outlined a tremendous number of great measures to mitigate and improve wildlife passage, and that left me kind of moving forward. How would y'all think about prioritizing these? A lot of this seems like opportunities, as DOTs replace bridges and culverts, there's some obvious opportunities, but looking overall, how would y'all think about prioritizing these, into the future?
Thank you, Hugh. The nature of this project has been collaborative, right? But ultimately it's up to the DOTs. They're the folks who have to make the changes on the ground. In our agenda, I was hoping we would discuss next steps. The goal of today's exercise is simply to present the recommendations, to give people an understanding of the results of the research, what we feel would improve both wildlife passage and driver safety. But in terms of next steps, I would recommend that the Tennessee DOT, the North Carolina DOT convene with a small group, a subcommittee perhaps, and talk about what's the next step. Is that some sort of a charrette in the fall? Do we bring the Federal Highways Administration ecological group back to help facilitate that discussion? So together we can come up with some priorities. I don't have the answer to that question. Manley, I saw your hand up. You want to come up here with the mic? Manley Fuller with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation is going to offer his thoughts to us. Online, by the way, Joe Clark said, I would like to add to Justin's question that motorist safety would be enough reason to promote elk crossings.
Thank you, Jeff. I wanted to point out, and I think probably a lot of you are aware of this, but in the federal bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's going to be $350 million available to the states to assist with wildlife crossings, and that'll be a competitive grant process, and there'll be more information coming out about that later this spring and in the summer. But I would personally like, in line with what we're talking about here today, that we don't miss any opportunities that may help us implement portions of what we're talking about today. So we would like very, very much, I think we and our friends with the Tennessee Wildlife Federation would very much like to see both North Carolina and Tennessee well positioned so that we can successfully compete for those monies. So I just wanted to throw that out there for people to be thinking about, and that's going to be inevitably that's going to be proposals from the state DOTs in coordination with their wildlife agency. So we just don't want to see us miss any opportunities. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Manley. You know, at our past quarterly meetings, I've had my colleague Christina up in DC give us updates on legislation. And so as Manley just said, the $350 million, I did talk to Christina the other day, and she said that the agency right now has a lot of money to spend with the passage of the infrastructure bill. And it's likely that these grants will not become available until the fall. So we do have a window of opportunity, certainly, to figure out what the priorities are. And I think together we can figure that out.
I'll get back to that. Something else that is billion for aquatic connectivity infrastructure improvement as well. So there's a couple different angles.
Thank you. Christine Laporte just made an observation that in the infrastructure bill, there's about $1 billion available for aquatic connectivity, replacing culverts and whatnot. I think one of the priorities for that is anadromous fish, salmon and whatnot, but there may be opportunities certainly here in the East where we don't have anadromous fish, but we have issues with connectivity that need to be addressed. Other folks? Rory, this is Aurora Wynn. She is interning with NPCA. She's a student at Warren Wilson College. Come on up, I'm going to hand you the microphone.
Speaking of next steps, and again, I'm just an intern, but something that Steve has really brought to my attention is that maybe one of the next steps conversation-wise needs to be collaboration between the DOT and engineers, looking at some of these opportunities for feasibility and logistics. Steve, has looked at sites as far as staging, but aside from that, the logistics are kind of unknown and probably need some study and some research and some collaboration with the DOT to look at pricing, what it's going to look like, feasibility for each site, and what the value of each site is, in collaboration with the DOT to figure out what they would be willing and capable of doing with this funding, so that when the grant process comes up, we know what we're asking for and how much it's going to cost.
Thank you, Rory. And you're not just an intern, by the way. You're much more than that. Let me also share something with all of you, both online and in the room here. Back when the bridges were announced, 5 bridges were going to be replaced in North Carolina, and the agency did not have funds for wildlife enhancements at those structures. The scope of those bridge replacements was bridge replacement only. A number of the NGOs came together and said, if we raise the money, will you work with us? And the answer was yes. So thus far, I believe we've raised about $114,000 or $115,000. And we are committed. The 7 NGOs that comprise the Safe Passage campaign are committed to starting a capital campaign to raise considerably more money for this effort. This is a true public-private partnership, and that gives us a lot of advantages. Let me tell you, whether it's Raleigh or Nashville or Washington, D.C., politicians and agency staff, they love to see public-private partnerships. So we have that in our favor. Joe Clark, it looks like, has another question. Let me, to Liz and Steve, what are the data gaps? What do you wish you had studied but did not have time or money to do so? Steve, they're gesturing at each other. Come on up, Steve. Thank you for the question, Joe.
Can I see Joe?
No, he's
okay. Hey, Joe, how are you? Okay. Hey, great question. I think we've been so busy just analyzing the data and getting to this point, we haven't thought too much about it. But what's neat is that all that mesocarnivore data that we collected, which is pretty substantial, we're in the process of partnering with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission and Clemson University with David Jakowski and a graduate student, Clinton Barden, with NCWRC to analyze that mesocarnivore data. And David's lab actually is he's done a lot with spotted skunks, a lot with mesocarnivores. And so bringing this component hopefully into his lab with, regarding connectivity and near I-40, we're hoping that adds a lot of value. So I guess we didn't really have time to do that. So we're kind of teaming up with them to get that research analyzed and published, hopefully by the end of this year. So that's one aspect. Yeah, and Liz is going to comment a little bit too. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Joe. And getting back to I think the limitations, and Justin McVeigh and I were just talking about this, is we do have, just 3 elk interacting with the roadway right now, and where we're seeing an animal cross, that's 1 individual. So we're seeing this to some level, but mine is, it's working, getting a little farther along with the modeling using the GPS data to model how the population moves through the landscape so we can get this larger scale. I think we're getting at that information now. It's just telling Justin I've had to divide the data into when the animals are resting, kind of foraging, and then when they're actually moving, making these longer steps and more directed turn angles. It's gotten complicated, but I do think this elk piece, which is taking a while, it's been a complicated data set, is going to help us get a little bit better at least where elk are moving now. But Justin has some concerns that the elk moving across the road look a bit inflated because they are just a couple individual animals with an awful lot of locations. But I think trying to understand that a little better, and then too, I think the flag on the Tennessee issues with the elk is pretty huge and a bit of an oversight prior. But some more partnerships there, some better understanding. Thanks, Joe.
Liz, if you could hang here just for a second. In terms of data gaps, I want to acknowledge that the tribe, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, had expressed an interest in us studying US 19 between Maggie Valley and Cherokee. So that's very much a data gap. We haven't done any research there, but you have a lot of collar data from that corridor that could be instructive. I know that the French Broad MPO, these are folks who have input on long-term planning for the DOTs, have expressed that they want to widen US 19. I don't know when that's going to happen, but when that does happen, this data could provide an opportunity for some mitigation. So
yeah, thanks for that lead in, because when we did start this project, it was to understand specifically how both I-40 and US 19 are influencing, elk movement and where they're crossing on both of those roads. So we have elk movement information for the region and where they're crossing US 19 and I-40 for this project, because we're focused on the Pigeon River Gorge. We've really focused it to the gorge. We have great information in this more detailed crossing of elk on US 19, the SoCo Gap area. There are some other road concerns for the entirety of North Carolina that are on that US 19 SoCo Gap Blue Ridge Parkway area, and where we have 3 elk crossing I-40, we have the majority, at least 11 of our animals at some point crossing US 19 or the Blue Ridge Parkway. So we have a big focus here, but some of these other elk issues we're seeing more in the Maggie Valley area. So looking forward to diving into that a little more.
thank you very much, Liz. We have a comment from Allison Connor online connected to the comment about raising funds for wildlife passage on the I-40 bridges. Have any of them been redesigned to incorporate passage, or is, I'm trying to read this comment, I have a little, or is that funding dependent? So is this a question for NCDOT Division 14? I don't want to put you guys on the spot. I know that the DOT is doing things at Harmon-Den, but Wanda Austin from Division 14, NCDOT, is going to take a shot at that.
I'll take a shot. So with the first bridge, yes, there would, we had started a preliminary design, and so there was, I don't know if you want to call it redesign, but the design started, we worked those into the process at that point. With the other 4 bridges, we're like 40% on 2 of them at this point. The next 2, 100%. So, those 2, there might be some redesign, depending on, what the application. Obviously, with the high bridge, there's not, that much redesign that needs to be done on the high bridge. But those are small. From the recommendations that I've seen, it looks like there's small impacts to the overall project. And then the last 2 bridges were just fairly a feasibility study, so there wouldn't be much redesign there.
Thank you, Wanda. I hope that answered your question, Allison. Josh from NCDOT. Outstanding. Josh from Division 14 NCDOT said there is wildlife fencing that's going to be incorporated with all of these bridge replacements, which is very exciting. And I want to say thank you for that. Very, very important. Wonderful. You know, we're making the world a better place for wildlife and for people too, who are traveling this busy corridor. 28,500 vehicles a day estimated right now, and that number is going northward on a pretty regular basis. We're about winding down on time. Any more thoughts online or in the house here? We've got Steve Goodman. Come on up, Steve. He's getting his exercise.
This is not directly to Joe Clark's question, but one beautiful thing about this project is not only the research that we conducted, there's more research coming out of it. And Joe is actually leading an effort to GPS collar some black bears within this corridor as a part of his larger, and Bill Starver's larger study in the park. So that's really exciting. And then we've also been able to assist the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission in some methods testing of various baits to help them in their survey efforts for the long-tailed weasel, this is a project that's going throughout the eastern US. So these are just like side things that came about. So we're going to learn more and more about the gorge as we move along.
Excellent, Steve. Yeah, you know, I think what you're seeing with these questions is there isn't one person in this room who can answer all these questions, right? That information is compartmentalized across different agencies, across different nonprofits, and that's where the collaboration comes in, because when you come together and you start sharing information, you get the fuller picture. Final thoughts from anybody? Any burning desires? Anyone want to come up and grab the mic? And okay, we've got another comment. Travis Wilson from the Wildlife Resource Commission. I've had some conversation with NCDOT in regards to the infrastructure bill and establishing a process to identify select projects for submittal. In short, they are still figuring things out internally to identify all the different pots of money in the bill. Hopefully I can get an update in the next couple of weeks. Thank you, Travis, and I will, you know, again, make available our government affairs people up in Washington, D.C. who are working on these issues regularly. At this point, it's 11:58, and our last agenda item was next steps, and I don't think we can really figure that out right here, right now. And what I want to suggest is that after this meeting, we pull together a small committee to engage with NCDOT and Tennessee DOT and figure out how can we come together. The next time we come together, what will that look like? How can we actually structure a meeting where we can start to dive into priorities, establishing priorities so that we can compete effectively for the resources that are available at the federal level. Does that sound like a good plan? I'm seeing thumbs up. I'm seeing some heads nodding. Wonderful. Well, I'm so grateful for your time and your effort. For those of you online, thanks for bearing with us through the technical issues. I'm grateful for each and every one of you. I will be, hi, Hani, good to see you. Hani from SHC just turned her camera on. We're grateful for your participation. If you're not aware, SAHC has acquired 2 parcels as a result of this 187-acre Wilkins Creek tract with almost a mile of frontage on I-40, one of our hottest hotspots, and the 147-acre Stevens Creek tract, which is adjacent to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So hats off to you and your colleagues, Hani. She's smiling and giving a thumbs up, as is Matt Drury from ATC. We will be in touch, folks. Thank you. Be well, be safe, and thank you for your partnership, each and every one of you.